Sacheen Littlefeather was a complete fraud, and this is how I know. That's what I'm going to talk to you about today in this episode of Straight Talk with Dina Gilio-Whitaker. So, my current book just came out in October of 2025. It is called Who Gets to Be Indian? Ethnic Fraud, Disenrollment, and Other Difficult Conversations about Native American Identity. And the book starts out in the first chapter with the story of how I knew Sacheen Littlefeather and how I came to this conclusion. And the book itself really is a result of that relationship, having known her or been acquainted with her since 2012 when I was writing for Indian Country Today Media Network. And, and an incident had happened at that time, and it was on the Jay Leno show, late night talk show. And he had on Dennis Miller, this kind of right wing comedian, and they made a racial slur about Sacheen. And the comment was in the context of a conversation they were having about Elizabeth Warren, who was being dissed because she had been, had maintained that she was Cherokee. And so they were kind of making fun of her, and they were saying that Dennis Miller said that, you know, Elizabeth Warren is about as much Indian as that stripper chick that Brando sent to reject the Oscar. And so some backstory here. What he was referring to in that comment was this incident that had happened in 1973, and that this is how Sacheen became so well known. It was the 1973 Oscars. Marlon Brando was up for an Academy Award for Best Actor for his role in The Godfather. And in the meantime, he had been very involved in activism on Native issues. This was a time we call the Red Power movement. There was a lot of Native activism going on at the time. And Sacheen had become acquainted with him. And so he had reached out to her and asked her that uh, for her to attend the Oscars in his place in case he won. It was her job to go up there on stage and intentionally reject that Oscar. Why? Because he wanted to make a statement about Native treatment in Hollywood, the treatment of Native people in Hollywood. At the time, it was still, beset by lots of stereotypes, not enough Native people getting roles for Native characters. It was very widespread practice for non-Native actors to be hired in Native roles, and that was still really happening in this era. And so he wanted to make a statement. The way it's been written about is that it's the first time that the Oscars had been used as a platform for political protest. So that's the backstory of who Sacheen Littlefeather was, because of course this is what happens. He loses, or he wins the Oscar, and she goes up on the stage, and she delivers this 78-second speech of him saying why he doesn't, why he respectfully rejects this very generous award. So so that sets the stage for like who Sacheen is and what happens. When she gets up there, she says to the audience, "Hello, my name is Sacheen Littlefeather. I'm Apache." And so she's dressed as in native regalia, in a buckskin dress, sort of plains style, and so and her hair is in not braids but ponytails with beaded hair ties. Why she decided to use ponytails instead of braids, I couldn't understand, but that's what it was. So, so this incident has made her famous, I say, It's her Warholian 15 minutes of fame. She becomes a hero to some and a pariah to others. And so this is how she goes down as this cultural icon in Indian country at this time. So that's what they were talking about on the Jay Leno show, which led me to be asked to write an article about this incident on the Jay Leno show. So so I get to know her because I had to interview her for it, and I hear the same story from her that she has always told about that incident having destroyed her career. So we chatted, got to know each other a little bit, and that was that. I did not hear from her again until about, I think, roughly 3 years later when she reached out to me and asked me if I would be willing to ghostwrite her memoir with her. And the reason was because she had been contacted by a literary agent in New York of a boutique agency, and they were soliciting a manuscript from her. It was getting very close to the Oscars, and it was during that time when the Oscars so white, remember hashtag Oscars so white, was really heating up, and this conversation about diversity in Hollywood and lots of criticism about it. So it was that with the context of what was happening at the time, and so we agreed to start working together. I was kind of looking forward to it. I My first book had just was just about to come out, and I was ready to write another book. And so we started working on it. We needed to develop a proposal, and then we would, turn it over to the agency, and they would shop it out and find a publisher. So we were in the middle of that process. I had gone up to the Bay Area where she was living, and we spent a few days together with me interviewing her for like 3 days in a row, just talking, getting to know her. And so I tell the story in that much more detail, a little bit more detail in the book. But while we were in the middle of this process, she went silent, and I didn't hear from her for several weeks. And she wasn't responding to phone calls, she wasn't responding to emails. And finally, I did hear from her I can't remember if it was a message or a phone call, but she said very briefly that she had decided to go in another direction, and didn't say what that meant, did not apologize, just disappeared. And so it was very bizarre for me. It was very weird. And so while this book didn't happen, in the meantime, what she had done was given me this journal. She had kept this journal that was handwritten, 200 pages of these entries that she had kept for about 4 or 5 years. And she gave me these photocopied pages of this journal. And so while this book didn't happen, I had this journal that she didn't ask to be returned. So I had this thing in my possession for years. Now, she had died in 2022, and I still had this thing, and I didn't know really what I was going to do with it, but I knew I was going to do something. After she died, I knew that that was the time, because I, had this artifact that had lots of evidence of who she was and who she wasn't. I analyzed all those pages and categorized them, and it was as much what she didn't write in the journal that revealed as much as what she did write. And so that's what I based my study of her on. And but also I had gotten to know her sisters, Roz and Trudy. And after Sacheen passed away, it was her sister Roz that was very vocal about who her sister was. She really wanted to set the record straight because so many times Sacheen had told a story about her being an abused Native American child who had been sexually abused by her father. She had told that story many times. It became part of her identity. But her sisters were very offended by that because they said it never happened. The persona that Sacheen Littlefeather had constructed was a complete fairy tale. And the sisters had tried to speak out about it, but were met with, you know, a lack of interest. So they weren't able to do anything about it until she finally passed away. And Jackie Keeler came out with the that bombshell article about about what she knew about Sacheen's heritage based on a genealogy that she had done. And so she, in that genealogy, she showed that Sacheen had absolutely no native heritage at all, certainly no Apache heritage. Sacheen had also claimed to be Yaqui. She didn't make those claims until some years later, but she had absolutely no evidence for either one of those claims. One of the things that Roz, Sacheen's sister, wanted people to know was that Sacheen was very mentally ill. And it wasn't a huge secret. It was something that Sacheen herself had talked about publicly a few times. But Roz really wanted to make it clear just how mentally ill Sacheen was. And she was, and that it was all over her journal. She wrote a lot about being mentally ill, and her diagnosis was schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder. So she she could hear voices. She heard voices. She had to be maintained with medication. And I actually, as I write about in the book, I witnessed an episode where she talked about she knew she was seeing something in the room that she knew wasn't there. And so she was making the point that she had to really work hard to manage that because it was so common. Even under medication, she was experiencing those kinds of symptoms. So, that raises questions about to what extent was her constructed identity as an Apache Yaqui Indian was a result of her mental illness, because it would be easy to attribute it to that. I think it played a role, but I don't think it explains it completely. And that's what I want to talk about now. I have 3 points that I want to make about my observations about why I knew she was a fraud, or why I do know that she's a fraud based on this experience and based on my conversations with Roz and Trudy and based on the journal. So the first point is that she intentionally lied about being Native. She claimed to be Apache, but there is absolutely no family ancestry about being Apache, uh, being from any Apache tribe anywhere, and she knew it. She knew that there was no, documentation. She was from a mixed race family. Her father was Mexican, and her mother was white. The father was uh, he was born in Oxnard, but his entire family lineage came from Mexico. And the Yaqui claims, like, it's very common for people of Mexican ancestry to claim or to trace their ancestry to Yaqui, even Apache lineages sometimes. That's something that I see frequently. Actually, it's not uncommon for Mexican people to have Apache heritage. But that was not the case with Sacheen because there was absolutely no stories in her family of having Apache heritage, and this is something that, Yaqui heritage, and that's something that her sisters are adamant about. So that Yaqui claim was likely speculative, because of this, common experience or common lineage in Mexican people. But nowhere in her journal does she mention being Yaqui. She does talk in some of her journal entries, not very many of them though. She does talk about being Apache. In fact, there's an entire story that I believe is a complete fabrication of what of a grandfather that she talks about who was Apache, and there's absolutely no reason to believe that what she wrote was true, and I go into that in detail in the book. Right after the Oscars incident, sometime within the first 6 months, the sisters discovered that Sacheen had actually gone in and had all three of their, how she was able to do this, I don't know, but she went in and was able to change all three of their birth certificates to have their father listed as Indian, not Mexican. And so that's a real blatant kind of act of fraud that that shows that, we can't just attribute her fantasy identity to her mental illness. A second point I'd like to make is that she lied about being an abused Native American child. This is what upsets Sasheen's sisters so much. It's what upsets them the most, really, and why they spoke out about her so vociferously after she passed away. According to Roz and Trudy, their father was not an alcoholic, as Sacheen had always maintained, and was not abusive in any way to any family member, and especially not sexually. He was not a sexual abuser. So he had died in 1966 when Sacheen was about 19, and she was away at school at that time. And he was deaf. He was also very sick for the last few years of his life. And uh, when you look at all of the details, it was really not likely. And in theory, could it have been possible? Anything can be possible. But in the sisters' lived experience, the reality is otherwise. They insist that it's otherwise, and so I think that that has to be respected. And another thing too is that in this 200-page journal, there is absolutely nothing about her being sexually abused by her father. And if that was something that was real, I would imagine that it would be something that she would have written about, because she spent so much energy writing about her mental illness. But yet there is nothing about that in there. And there's one third point that I want to make, and that I make in the book, and this is about how she talked about the importance of being a good role model of Native people having accurate representation. But the paradox about that is that when you actually look at some of the roles that she played, now remember, she was an aspiring actress in 1973 when that Oscars incident happened. She was trying to break into film. She started out as a model. She had started in Salinas. That's where she grew up, in Salinas. She had gone to a local photography studio owned by a man named Ken Cook. He did some headshots for her. He later came out and said that she was complete phony, that she was just trying to capitalize on the Indian thing. That's how he put it, because it was very trendy. It was starting to be very trendy, because Native Americans were getting popular in the 1970s and losing the stigma that they had had in previous decades. So she did these headshots. She was auditioning for different roles, and but she really hadn't done much of any significance by 1973 with the Oscars incident. But what we can show beyond a shadow of a doubt is that after the Oscars incident, that's when her career kind of took off, and she had gotten roles. So this is contra to all her claims that the Oscars incident had ruined her career. She had always claimed that, but the facts betray that narrative. And some of those roles that she had done while she was trying to make it as an actress are pretty troubling. And I would start with the Playboy layout that she had done. Before the Oscars incident, she had participated in this photo shoot for Playboy that was called 10 Little Indians, and they had gotten some Native American women, or at least Native American looking women, to do this theme about Native American women doing in these, this nude photo layout. So she was part of that, but it had never been published. Well, right after the Oscars incident, Playboy went ahead and ran a, a piece in the magazine just of her, of the photos of her. And I will tell you, she was very proud of those photos. I saw those photos when I was with her, and she really loved to show them, and to show them off. So that was one, like, questionable judgment call that she had made as a Native woman who supposedly stood for being a positive role model for Native people. Another one was, she had played in an Italian film called Il Consigliere, which means the lawyer, and she had a little bit part in that film as a prostitute. She didn't play a native person per se, to my knowledge, but she did play this, again, very sexualized role as a prostitute. But finally, there was one role that she did in a film called Johnny Firecloud that was kind of a knockoff of the Billy Jack series. And in this really bad film, she plays a teacher, a Native American teacher, who gets gang raped by a bunch of cowboys in her classroom. And the scene is so graphic that when I first learned about this scene, and it was because it was circulating in porn sites, and so to this day, it could very well. I haven't gone to look for it recently, but I would not be surprised if that clip is still circulating. So it really raises a lot of questions about being a positive role model for Native people when she had that kind of history. And her, it's just one example of her story being so full of holes and contradictions, and and just flat out lies that we have to sort of take the Occam's razor approach, and that's that the simplest explanation is probably the right information, um, or explanation, that she was a fraud, her family knew it, and now the facts are out there, and we have to just accept it for what it is. Thanks for listening. See you next time.